Dogen's Genjokoan is quite a short text, but it's a hugely important and influential one. It was written actually about 6 years after Dogen returned to Japan after studying in China. And in some ways it's a manifesto for what he understood as the basic meaning is the wrong word, purpose is the wrong word, practice is maybe a better word of Zen. What Zen is about. There are so many ways that one could approach this text, and we've been talking about not separate as a way of understanding the world, a way of understanding the practice. And so I want to approach Dogen's Genjokoan from the point of view of not separate. I'm going to read, and as I read, I'll gloss, chat, probably go way off tack. But I'll try and get us to the end and hopefully not take too long about it. So I'll try and be brief, and we'll skimp and we'll skate and we'll summarise. And we can come back to this text over and over again, and probably will. Genjokoan. When all dharmas are the Buddha Dharma, there is delusion and realization, practice, life and death, Buddhas and living beings. When the 10,000 dharmas are without fixed self, there is no delusion and no realization, no Buddhas and no living beings, no birth and no death. Since the Buddha way, by nature, goes beyond the dichotomy of abundance and deficiency, there is arising and perishing, delusion and realization, living beings and Buddhas. Therefore, flowers fall even though we love them, weeds grow even though we dislike them. Conveying oneself towards all things to carry out practice enlightenment is delusion. All things coming and carrying out practice enlightenment through the self is realization. Those who greatly realize delusion are Buddhas. Those who are greatly deluded in realization are living beings. Furthermore, there are those who attain realization beyond realization, and those who are deluded within delusion. And in a sense, that's as far as we need to go. That says it all. But of course, what is it actually saying? It's 4 paragraphs, and they seem a bit random, but they're actually set out in quite a logical order. So let's dive back in, see what happens. When all dharmas are the Buddha Dharma, there is delusion and realization, practice, life and death, Buddhas and living beings. Okay, so this is the world, the experience, the point of view of life as we know it, everyday life, the relative, our world of understanding, our world of perception and experience, our world of things. And one of the things which is interesting here is that, of course, we get opposites here. There is delusion and realization, life and death, all these experience, all these realities, and Buddhas and living beings. Right at the beginning, Dogen's making the point that, okay, we're talking about Buddhas and living beings, but we're not saying they're somehow categorically different. It's not there's a world of Buddhas and then there's a world of living beings. This is the same world. Then he goes on. When the 10,000 dharmas are without fixed self, there is no delusion and no realization, no Buddhas and no living beings, no birth and no death. Okay, so this is coming at it from the point of view of the absolute, the universal. Now, as soon as we make this distinction, our tendency is always to rush off and make this into a dualism and into a hierarchy. And we say, okay, we have on the one hand the world of thought and description and everyday life, and then on the other hand there's this absolute truth. Surely that must be where I'm going. Surely that's the really real. Surely that's the reality behind this illusion of everyday life. Surely that's where the Buddhas are. Well, no. Because this isn't a separate world, it's not a separate realm, it's not a separate level, it's not a separate anything. And if we know our basic Madhyamika Buddhist philosophy, we know that this is exactly, not one hair's breadth, not one atom of difference between the relative and the absolute. And yet there's a difference between samsara and nirvana. And it's in this gap that is no gap, this distinction that is no distinction, that the whole of our practice and the whole of our understanding rests and has to sit. Not separate. The reason that I quite like talking in terms of not separate, and of course we're using words and we're using ideas, and that's absolutely to tie ourselves to the relative, always. But still, not separate can point. Not separate is not the same. It's not one. It's not uniformity. And our tendency is to rush off and try and think of the absolute in terms of one, in terms of same, not separate. And equally with the relative, we have the appearance of separation and the reality of not separate. But not separate is not one. It's not the elimination of difference. The absolute is the realm, I hate that word, the absolute is the experiencing, the way of conceiving of the world, the way of perceiving the world in the way that is not making distinctions between things, beings. Enough. Section 3. Since the Buddha way, by nature, goes beyond the dichotomy of abundance and deficiency, there is arising and perishing, delusion and realization, living beings and Buddhas. And that since there is really interesting. Since the Buddha way, by nature, goes beyond all dichotomies, and actually the dichotomy between the relative and the absolute, because they are finally not separate. The fact that things have no final fixity, no final separation, the fact of impermanence, the fact of constant change, the fact of relationship, means there is arising and perishing, delusion and realization, living beings and Buddhas, and that this is not something to be got over, not something to be transcended, not something to be gone beyond. This is simply what is, and the absolute nature of the absolute truth and the relative nature of the relative truth, nirvana, samsara, require and presuppose this. So then we get to therefore. So we've had since these are not separate. And now we imply, we require coming and going, living and dying, growth and decay, impermanence. So therefore, this is where we bring us back in, not as an abstract idea, which we've been kind of talking about until now. Therefore, flowers fall even though we love them. We love them. Are we supposed to stop loving them? Is this supposed to not matter? Therefore, flowers fall even though we love them. Weeds grow even though we dislike them. And this is the reality of life. This is not the reality of our contingent, rubbish, inadequate relative lives. This is the reality of life. This is the business of life itself. This absolute inseparability, mutual necessity of relative and absolute. Not something we can put down and go somewhere else. Buddhas are here and now. Sentient beings are here and now. Why? Because there is nowhere else to be. Okay, so then we take what seems like a slightly different tack. How does this relate? Still part of the same section. This is section 4. We've had, therefore flowers fall even though we love them. Weeds grow even though we dislike them. Yeah, this is real. I love things. Things hurt me. And we're talking about me and you. We're talking about us as selves. Not, oh, when I get rid of this stupid self thing, it'll all be fine. No. We love. Things hurt us. We live. We grow. We decay. We die. This is our life. Okay, so how do we relate to this? How do we relate to practice? Conveying oneself towards all things to carry out practice enlightenment is delusion. All things coming and carrying out practice enlightenment through the self is realization. The most obvious reference I can think in terms of this is all the work that we've been doing around the idea of mastery. This idea of a centre, which is a subject, a knower, moving outwards into a world of objects, which are there to be used as instruments, are there to serve the purposes of mastery. This is advancing outwards, always thinking further and further out, this expansion of self. It doesn't allow the world, the 10,000 things, all things, to be 10,000 things, to be all things. It requires of them the utility their usefulness, and that's all. And this so often is how we approach the world and even approach our practice. What's it for? What can I do with it? Can I become a Buddha like this? The obverse of this is all things coming and carrying out practice enlightenment through the self. And this is relationship. It's not that I stop being a self and then suddenly everything's fine. Suddenly I'm on the same level as everything else. No, there is this thing, one of the 10,000 things, this thing, this self, and there are all these other things, objects, ideas, sentient beings, me and you. Allow them to come to us. Allow them to be what they are. Allow them to enter into relationship with us rather than this, I know you. I can use you. And that's as true of what we like to think of as nature, and it's as true of each other, and it's as true of the book I read, or opening and shutting a door, or sitting on my cushion. And it's actually as true of the way that I address this body, this mind. Conveying oneself towards all things to carry out practice enlightenment is delusion. All things coming and carrying out practice enlightenment through the self is realization. It's not the self which is the issue, it's our mode of selfing. The way we are, what we are, the way we act, the way we inhabit this world of things of which we are. Those who greatly realize delusion are Buddhas. We're not going to get away from this delusion business, as Dogen makes quite clear later on. Delusion is what we are. And yet, those who are greatly deluded in realization, those who think they have enlightenment taped, those who think they can just step outside delusion, are living beings. We can put this another way. How can I realize delusion? Well, I can begin to become aware of my own deludedness. Not as a kind of, oh, I'm so deluded, but in a way of actually experiencing the nature of this delusion and deludedness, not the simple fact, but the texture, the grain of this delusion and how it links to other delusions, how it manifests a certain way of being in the world. As my own teacher Barry Magid always says, no delusion as great as the delusion that I can be without any delusions. It just doesn't work, and Dogen makes this point quite clearly. When Buddhas are truly Buddhas, they don't need to perceive they are Buddhas. However, they are enlightened Buddhas and they continue actualizing Buddha. In seeing colour and hearing sound with body and mind, although we perceive them intimately, the perception is not like reflections in a mirror or the moon in water. When one side is illuminated, the other is dark. The only thing I really want to say about this is this central sentence. In seeing colour and hearing sound, although we perceive them intimately, hearing, seeing, It's not like reflections in a mirror or the moon in water. Because reflections in a mirror, there's something seeing something else, and when I see the reflection, well, I'm seeing the reflection. It's not like there's a reflection going on in my mind. It's not like seeing a reflection of the moon in water. My perceiving, my seeing, my hearing is part of my being in the world. It's not part of my separation from the world. But that idea that I'm representing the world, and that's what I'm doing, is part of this kind of whole subject-object mastery. Oh no, I'm a separate thing. I'm this thing here, and there's that world out there. That's one of the ways in which we misunderstand our delusion. And then this classic phrase, section 6, which we spent all of last week's talk around. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be verified by all things. To be verified by all things is to let the body and mind of the self and the body and mind of others drop off. There is a trace of realization that cannot be grasped. We endlessly express this ungraspable trace of realization. To forget the self is to be verified by all things. Really relates exactly to all things coming and carrying out. Practice enlightenment through the self is realization. We're talking about the same process of letting the world and letting this thing be this thing. Maybe go back and listen to the last talk again. We could just go round again. This idea of dropping off, though, again, this is important. And it's certainly true that when I'm sitting Zazen, I'm letting the world that is me guide me. I'm not intentionally taking myself in a direction. The world as me, the world that is me, comes and finds me in my Zazen. Of course it does. I think thoughts. I feel emotions. Where do these come from? Where do these go? My one concern really here is to let them be what they need to be, both in their coming and going, and not pull them towards me or push them away from me. Not to advance towards all things, but to let things realize through this self, as this self. When one first seeks the Dharma, one strays far from the boundary of the Dharma. When the Dharma is correctly transmitted to the self, one is immediately an original person. If one riding in a boat watches the coast, one mistakenly perceives the coast as moving. If one watches the boat in relation to the surface of the water, then one notices that the boat is moving. Similarly, when we perceive the body and mind in a confused way, we grasp all things with a discriminating mind. We mistakenly think that the self-nature of the mind is permanent. When we intimately practice and return right here, it's clear that all things have no fixed self. Impermanence. And also, talk about delusion start, aren't we? If one riding in a boat watches the coast, one mistakenly perceives the coast as moving. Okay, it looks like it's going past, but actually I'm moving relative to the coast. But if one sees differently, If one shifts one awareness, one shifts one attention. If one watches the boat in relation to the surface of the water, then one notices that the boat is moving. It's not the world going past. It's me, it's the boat that's actually moving through world. World moves through world. It's not a film, it's not a show, it's not the world out there and me here. I am world. I am world worlding. I am moving. When we intimately practice and return right here, it's clear that all things have no fixed self. I am not permanent. I am not the centre. I am not separate. Firewood becomes ash. Ash cannot become firewood again. However, we should not view ash as after and firewood as before. We should know that firewood dwells in the Dharma position of firewood and has its own before and after. Although before and after exist, past and future are cut off. Ash stays in the position of ash with its own before and after. As firewood never becomes firewood again after it's burned to ash, there is no return to living after a person dies. However, in Buddha Dharma, it is an unchanged tradition not to say that life becomes death. Therefore, we call it no arising. It is the established way of Buddha's turning the Dharma wheel not to say that death becomes life. Therefore, we call it no perishing. Life is a position in time. Death is also a position in time. This is like winter and spring. We don't think that winter becomes spring, and we don't say that spring becomes summer. And this is talking about, well, and again, there's a danger here, isn't there? This is talking about the reality of this. We can call it this moment, but it's always a kind of moment in space, moment of relationships, this configuration of relationship. And each momentary configuration of relationship is distinct in that sense from every other. So that when I'm just sat here, just being this zazen, I'm just this zazen. I'm not preoccupying myself with past. I'm not planning future. And yet, before and after still coexist a memory, a wish. Before and after are there, although past and future are cut off. And okay, that's in a more psychological way of thinking. Is this literally true of each thing moment? Inventing a term, we could call it any damn thing we like, but the important thing is to realise this is not a fixed thing going through time, and it's not just a moment in time. It's this configuration, this set of relationship, which will be different in the next moment. What's the connection? What's the connectedness between past and future? It's important to think in this term, in this sense of Dharma positions, but also without denying that continuity, that connection between Dharma positions. Ash is distinct from firewood, and yet clearly there is still a connection between them. Again, we don't want to make a thing. We don't want to make a separation. It's all not separate. But if we challenge ourselves, if we challenge our mind, we can begin to do that. When a person attains realization, it's like the moon's reflection in water. The moon never becomes wet. The water is never disturbed. Although the moon is a vast and great light, it is reflected in a drop of water. The whole moon and even the whole sky are reflected in a drop of dew on a blade of grass. Realization does not destroy the person, as the moon does not make a hole in the water. The person does not obstruct realization, as a drop of dew does not obstruct the moon in the sky. The depth is the same as the height. To investigate the significance of the length and brevity of time, we should consider whether the water is great or small, and understand the size of the moon in the sky. That is actually astonishingly beautiful, but let's just think about this in terms of relationship of self here. Again, we're being quite, in a sense, quite clear that this is not about abandoning our experience of reality. It's not about going somewhere else. It's not about some separate state, some wonderful way of being. When a person attains realization, it's like the moon's reflection in water. Okay, the moon never becomes wet. There's no difference, there's no change. The water is never disturbed. Although the moon is a vast and great light, it's reflected in a drop of water. The moon is not separate. The moon's light is not separate. This is, in so many places, Dogen talks about one moment of zazen, all beings are enlightened. It's this connection, because things are ultimately not separate. Because there is ultimately not a me becoming realized or not becoming realized, as distinct from a you. There's no change, and yet. And this realization extends everywhere, and yet. The whole moon and even the whole sky are reflected in a drop of dew on a blade of grass. Okay, but then just in case we were still wondering, realization does not destroy the person. And then this wonderful phrase, as the moon does not make a hole in the water, no change. And yet, everything is transformed. But it's not a question about, self, nasty, bad. The person does not obstruct realization, as a drop of dew does not obstruct the moon in the sky. Why? Because there is no separation, or no final separation. Because things are always in relationship. When a fish swims, no matter how far it swims, it doesn't reach the end of the water. Why? Because if it did, it would stop being a fish. When a bird flies, no matter how high it flies, it cannot reach the end of the sky. Why? Because a bird has to be in the sky. When the bird's need or the fish's need is great, the range is large. Yeah, well, fair enough. When the need is small, the range is small. It's relative, it's relational. In this way, each fish and each bird uses the whole of space and vigorously acts in every place, because acting here affects everything. However, if a bird departs from the sky or a fish leaves the water, it immediately dies. Sort of literally true, but the important point is what is a bird? A bird is something which flies in the sky. What is a fish? A fish is something that swims in the water. And there's a specific set of ways of being of that embodiment, a set of delusions of that embodiment. In this way, each fish and each bird uses the whole of space and vigorously acts in every place. We should know that for a fish, water is life. For a bird, sky is life. A bird is life. A fish is life. Life is a bird. Life is a fish. And we should go beyond this. There is practice enlightenment. This is the way of living beings. What do living beings do? Well, fish swim, birds fly. Living beings practice enlightenment. What do Buddhas do? Well, actually they practice enlightenment too. This is what we are. This is what makes us us, that we practice enlightenment. Therefore, if there are fish that would swim or birds that would fly only after investigating the entire ocean or sky, they would find neither path nor place. When we make this very place our own, our practice becomes the actualization of reality. Okumura's translation in this context of Genjokoan, the very title of this piece. When we make this path our own, our activity naturally becomes actualized reality, Genjokoan. This path, this place, is neither big nor small, neither self nor others, not separate. It's not existed before this moment, nor has it come into existence now. Therefore, the reality of all things is thus. In the same way, when a person engages in practice enlightenment in the Buddha way, as the person realizes one dharma, the person permeates that dharma. As the person encounters one practice, the person fully practices that practice. For this there is a place and a path. The boundary of the known is not clear. This is because the known, which appears limited, is born and practiced simultaneously with the complete penetration of the Buddha Dharma. We should not think that what we have attained is conceived by ourselves and known by our discriminating mind. Although complete enlightenment is immediately actualized, its intimacy is such that it does not necessarily form as a view. In fact, viewing is not something fixed. Which is a hell of a statement, and I'm not going to try and gloss that in the kind of 2 minutes I have remaining. I just say the last section of Genjokoan is actually a koan. Zen Master Baoch of Mount Magu was waving a fan. A monk approached him and asked, "The nature of wind is ever present and permeates everywhere. Why are you waving a fan?" Well, next time we'll look at that koan and we'll see how it actually describes the whole of Genjokoan, the whole arc of Genjokoan, and the whole problem and the whole nature of our practice. So we'll pause there and we'll pick this up again next time.